Revelation's Christology is built on the idea that Jesus is God's chosen Messiah. In order to understand Jesus' role as king, it would make sense to understand his role as having been chosen by God to fulfill this function. And so when in chapter 5, the scene of the Lamb receiving these messianic epithets, the titles, and then receiving the scroll in particular is symbolic of this election.
Welcome back to the podcast. We've got another excellent episode for you today. My guest is Dr. Justin Jeffcoat Schedtler. He's assistant professor of religion at Wartburg College, and he's written a wonderful new book called Royal Ideologies in the Book of Revelation. This is actually the first episode that we've done on Revelation, so I had to sneak in a couple general Revelation questions for the audience, along with what we talk about in the book, how the language of Jesus fits within discourses about kingship, royalty, Messianism within the ancient Mediterranean world. We nerd out at a number of points in this episode, but I think there's also a lot of really important practical pastoral takeaways. So I hope you enjoy. For those who may be new to the channel or listening to our podcast, we'd very much appreciate it if you like and subscribe to us, turn on your notifications so that you get updates for all of our new content. Comments and reviews are always very much appreciated. There's a lot that goes into this work, and it's always nice to know when people are listening and benefiting in some ways. I do my best when possible to respond to all comments. The best way you can support us, the work that we're doing, if you're interested, you've been following us and you've been benefiting in one way or another, is to become a member of the Center for Bible Study. Membership is really easy. It can be for any amount, any dollar amount you want, just a recurring monthly donation. Could be as little as $1 if that's what you want to do, or 5 or 10 or whatever. Your membership helps support the ongoing work we're doing here. It also gets you access to all of the archives of the past classes we've taught and entrance into all of our future classes. We're constantly teaching new classes on the Bible, on theology. And so this is kind of what we do. We want to make this stuff available. But in order to do that, we do need support, small dollar donations. We're a nonprofit, and all of donations are tax deductible. So if you would consider that, we'd very much appreciate you supporting us in that way. And with that, let's go ahead and jump into our episode with Dr. Jeffcoat Schedtler. Back to the podcast. I'm really excited today to have on Dr. Justin Jeffcoat Schedtler with us. He has written a really fantastic book, a careful study of Revelation, situating all the language of Jesus within broader messianic, but also just royal ideology, Greek and Roman ideology. So really helpful to understand what Revelation is doing in its context. We're going to dive into all that here in a minute. But Dr. Jeffcoat Schedtler, thanks for being with us.
Thanks for inviting me. Happy to be here.
Yeah, my pleasure. So just to get us started, could you give us a little bit of background into who you are, how you got into biblical studies, kind of what motivates your research today?
Yeah. Well, I teach at a small liberal arts college in Northeast Iowa. It's called Wartburg College. I went to a school a lot like Wartburg in Minnesota, St. Olaf College, where I tried to do anything other than take classes in religion, let alone biblical studies. I was an economics major. I wanted to go into business, and had absolutely no ambition to be a scholar, much less a Bible scholar. So I actually made it into the business world and realized how little I wanted to actually be in the business world. And so I tried to figure out what would be 180 degrees from that work. And so I ended up at a seminary, Luther Seminary in St. Paul, Minnesota, and kind of floundered for a while until I took my first Greek class with David Fredrickson, New Testament professor there, and loved the Greek. I was pretty good at it, and so I asked him what a person could do who really loved ancient Greek, and he said, "Well, you could become a New Testament professor." And I said, "Well, that sounds interesting. I've never thought about this." He said, "Well, it's going to be a lot of work, especially for you, because you don't have a background in religious studies or languages or biblical studies." And so I got a degree in classical and Near Eastern studies at the University of Minnesota with Melissa
Mm.
Harl Selu, and completed my work at the seminary, and then studied under Luke Timothy Johnson and Carl Holliday and Vernon Robbins and Steve Krafchick at Emory University.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah, so really kind of low level schools you went to.
well, yeah, and miraculously, I made it through those programs, and
Yeah, those are great
ended up
programs.
here. So yeah, I'm kind of I ended up here kind of by accident, I guess. This is not a lifelong goal, but I love where I am.
Yeah, no, that's cool. Well, and if you want to take 180-degree turn from business, because I was a business major in college as well,
Mm,
Bible's about as much 180-degree turn as you can get,
yeah.
right?
Uh-huh.
There's just nothing about Bible that speaks of business or making money or anything
Yeah.
of that nature.
Right. Yeah. There are very few similarities.
Yeah, that's cool. That's cool. All right, well, let's dive into the book then. I'd love to get just a little bit of your thinking in writing the book. As you bring out in the introduction, it's kind of odd that there's been a lot of great studies on Revelation's Christology. I think about people like Richard Bauckham that have done a lot of important work, but it's kind of actually strange to me when I think about it and read your book now, that there hasn't been that much work done on the messianism of Revelation or royal ideologies in particular, especially given that, in being a non-specialist in Revelation, just looking at the book, it seems like one of the most messianic books in the New Testament on its face,
Yeah.
in terms of the imagery and so forth. So, what do you think the deal is there? Why haven't people done much work in that area? And what were you hoping to do with this book?
Yeah. I can't tell you why Revelation scholars haven't looked at the messianic aspects more closely or more broadly in the way that I've tried to. I can tell you that folks, both in our kind of current generation and in previous generations who have worked in messianism, as with most topics in biblical studies, tend rarely, if ever, to get to the book of Revelation. So, people tend to
Mm-hmm.
start with Paul
Mm-hmm.
and kind of move outwards towards the periphery as if Paul were the center, kind of to the Gospels, um, pastorals. Revelation, I mean, I tell this to everyone. I kind of have a soapbox about how odd it is to me that Revelation gets such short shrift
Mm-hmm.
kind of across the board. And so it wasn't surprising to me that folks who do messianism just tend not to get to Revelation.
Mm-hmm.
No, that's not true of everyone. I mean, John and Della Collins and their work with
Yeah.
kingship discourses and messianism, they more than touch on Revelation, but I just think this is part and parcel of a broader issue with Revelation, kind of people feeling like they can't broach the book for some reason, or I don't know. But within Revelation studies, as I give credit where I can to people who have worked individually with some of the topics I deal with. Patronage and benefaction has been something that comes up in Revelation studies, but not so much as it relates to kingship discourses. So the patron-client relationship is really clear in Revelation, but yes, it hasn't been looked at in terms of its place within a messianic discourse or
Mm-hmm.
kingship ideology.
Yeah.
But in the conclusion, I say that I hope that changes. I hope my book kind of spawns more interest in this topic.
Yeah.
Folks who put out, and Joshua Jipp has put out a messianic, the messianic theology of the New Testament. He has a really nice chapter in Revelation, which is, like most of his work, very far-reaching and covers a lot of ground in a very short amount of time. So I think people are working in it.
Mm-hmm.
We'll see where it goes.
Yeah, that's great. Well, and a plug for the book too. You just do such a great job of collecting together primary sources for people. So those of you that are interested in, like, hey, I want to understand more of this, where do I start? Justin's book is great for that because he's not just giving you his own thought or synthesis. I mean, he does that, but he's giving you just a lot of primary source material that you can then yourself kind of go to. I love that about books like this, that they get you back into the primary sources, which sometimes we don't necessarily do. And I think for those who aren't in biblical studies, people that are listening to this are either interested in biblical studies or wanting to do more. One of the most important things that we do actually is go into primary sources. And oftentimes that's what leads to new and fresh scholarly insights as well, because maybe you have a generation or two saying the same thing over and over and over. And someone goes back to the primary source and says, well, wait a minute, we haven't really considered this, or this got misinterpreted or whatever. So that's something that I really appreciate about the book, is just the careful attention you have to primary source material.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate that.
So I think the entryway maybe to talking about the various chapters is a lot of attention on the book, rightfully so, is placed on the visionary material that kind of, if we're thinking about the structure of Revelation, right, you have the opening apocalypse that leads to the 2 chapters of the 7 letters. And then we have chapters 4 and 5, which are the heavenly throne room visions that are kind of the driving force of the apocalypse. So it makes sense that you would spend a lot of time in chapters 4 and 5, and in particular in chapter 5, because this is where we see the slain lamb come to the throne. So could you maybe just take us a little bit into that scene just to frame it up for our audience, and then we can talk about specific aspects of what you do from there.
Yeah. Well, you're right in terms of how Revelation scholars tend to divide the book up. So chapters 4 through 22 kind of constitute it's not a unity in terms of where the source material may have came from, but scholars kind of look to 4 through 22 as a unit, and then 1, 2, and 3 are kind of different. Scholars do different things with it and try and associate it with the vision material in different ways. But yeah, 4 and 5 are the center. Like geographically in the text, the throne room is the center of the universe, with the one seated on the throne in the center of the center. So really, it's a very, to me, it's a strong theological text. It makes strong theological claims about the centrality of God in heaven, and these kind of have these circles outward from there. Worship directed towards God in chapter 4. And interestingly for me, I wrote my dissertation on the hymns in Revelation. So you have some of the most conspicuous and best examples of explicit hymns in the whole New Testament in the book of Revelation. I mean, people find hymns elsewhere in Paul's letters and in the Gospels, but they kind of have to intuit that these were source hymns that Paul then appropriated into his letters. Whereas in Revelation, it's explicit. These are hymns being sung by a choir. And then you have the contents of the hymn. So the hymns themselves directed towards God in chapter 4, and then to the Lamb in chapter 5 are themselves really important in the study of early Christian thought and narrative, and probably practice, insofar as it relates to what Christians were probably doing at this time. Chapter 5, just as chapter 4 demonstrates the centrality of God in the throne room, chapter 5 makes the claim that the crucified and risen Christ is right there, if not sharing the throne with God. And there's a big debate about this, whether Jesus is sharing God's own throne or is kind of seated next to God. And the language, the Greek, is ambiguous or ambivalent. But those 2 chapters are not only the geographic kind of center of the text, but the conceptual center too. Everything issues from the throne room. Things, come from the throne room outwards towards the world, and then the world kind of relates back to the throne room. So yeah, chapters 4 and 5 are extremely important to understanding the theology and the Christology and the structure of Revelation as a whole.
Yeah, great. So in that scene where we were talking about, we have Jesus, the risen Christ, coming to approaching the throne and then taking his seat and opening the scroll. You talk about like this scene in terms of divine election and how that fits into broader thematic notions of divine election in the ancient Mediterranean world. What do you think is important about divine election there, and what's the significance for understanding what Jesus is doing in that scene?
Well, my premise in the book is that Revelation's Christology is built on the idea that that Jesus is God's chosen Messiah, King. In order to understand Jesus' role as King, it would make sense to understand his role as having been chosen by God to fulfill this function. So kings in the ancient Mediterranean world and in Israelite traditions and in some Second Temple Jewish traditions, kings are just almost universally thought to have been, if not placed on the throne by the gods or God, that God gives the eventual king requisite traits or skills in order to be able to ascend to the throne. So if Jesus is God's chosen Messiah in the book of Revelation, which I argue that it is, I think it's fairly obvious, then the notion that God would have chosen Jesus for this task has to be there somewhere. And so when in chapter 5, the scene of the Lamb receiving these messianic epithets, the titles, and then receiving the scroll in particular is symbolic of this election. So throughout the chapter on divine election, I try and demonstrate how common it was for Alexander and Hellenistic kings, and then in the Roman world for the emperors to demonstrate their divine chosenness on coins or in various narrative forms. Oftentimes, emperors will show themselves, wielding the thunderbolt of Zeus. It's like this is the the symbol of their not only relationship with divinity, but their kind of chosenness.
Yeah.
And
No, that's really helpful. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no. So I think the scroll functions in that way in Revelation 5.
Yeah,
that was it. You didn't interrupt a big thought. It was
no, sorry. No, you just had me excited. I had to jump in. Yeah, and I think one thing I would say too for our audience that is really helpful here in what you're doing, it doesn't just pertain to Revelation. It actually pertains to the whole New Testament, which is that I think sometimes people are surprised that Jesus doesn't just come out and announce who he is, or take it kind of thing. Like, why not? Well, he's God in the flesh. But in reality, whether it's the Messiah or another ancient ruler, they don't make themselves the ruler. God does that. And you have that in the baptismal scene. You have that in the resurrection, the enthronement, wherever you can think. I mean, even when Jesus asks his disciples, "Who do you say that I am?" He doesn't say he's a Messiah. He has them declare him Messiah. Right. You don't make yourself the Messiah typically. I mean, you can get a band of people together and make a little messianic movement. Some people do that, but still, even in those, maybe you have to have somebody else acclaim you Messiah. So there's just a very strong strand of the need to be elected in royal ideology. And I think that's one thing you bring out really, really nicely. Obviously, it happens here in Revelation in chapter 5. So,
well, I think that's you bring up the point that the divine election of Jesus, the messianic character of Jesus, is not something that he can kind of claim for himself. In fact, it seems like in certain instances, Jesus goes out of his way not to make that claim. But yeah, it's a requirement. The divine election. Not in all, and I point out some Second Temple Jewish contexts where other mechanisms are used to legitimate kings. So lineage to David, though there's an indirect connection with promise and chosenness there,
Hmm.
with
Hmm.
being part of the promise to David. But lineage and things. There are other mechanisms for legitimating one's ascent to the throne, but this divine chosenness is kind of it can't get any better than that. Like
Yeah.
you can't get any more grounded in legitimacy than God legitimating your place there.
Yeah. And we alluded to the emperor here and the, kind of Augustinian ideology and how that spills over to, the Julian Claudian emperors and so forth. What do you think that Revelation 4 and 5 can be understood or should be understood as a kind of counter scene, as it were, to the kind of claims that I guess these are late? This is Vespasian and his lineage, right? We're probably thinking of maybe Domitian or something, like a kind of counter liturgy to what we have going on in like the Caesar cults in like Asia Minor area.
Yeah, totally. And I think, reviewing my book recently, in order to be able to speak with you intelligibly about it, that's one thing that actually came up is I could have made a bigger point. And I think much more could be said about the extent to which Revelation's throne room liturgy, the worship of God and the Lamb, serves as, about as explicitly as is possible as a counter to imperial liturgies and the worship of the king. So, Revelation 13 and the beasts and the
Mm-hmm.
improper worship of the beasts and, their relationship, the fact that the beasts claim the throne of Satan,
Mm-hmm.
is just, it's parallel
Mm-hmm.
to in several ways to the place of the Lamb on God's throne and the worship of the Lamb as God's divine Messiah. So the eventual demise of the beasts signals, you can hitch your wagon to the beasts, to the imperial structures if you want, and a lot of people did that and still do that. But the beasts will meet their end, and that's the tale that Revelation tells. Is so you can either hitch your wagon to the beasts or to the Lamb, and that there are implications for both, and the implications of loyalty to the beast and the imperial powers is death ultimately, and loyalty to God through the Lamb has a much better result, according to
Yeah.
the author of Revelation. So, yeah, the counterpoint there is critical to what the author of Revelation is trying to convey. I think it's a great
Yeah.
point.
Yeah. Yeah. Good. 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 Yeah. Thanks for bringing up that point too about the beast. That was something that you did bring that out in the book. The parallelism there between the throne sharing of the Lamb and then the clear transition from 12 to 13, where the beast is the one who shares the throne of Satan. So it was an important
Yeah.
parallel. So since we're on that topic, why don't we discuss the concept of throne sharing a little bit for our audience? First of all, kind of what is that? What do we mean by throne sharing, and how does that function with Revelation? I think there is a little bit, if you don't mind too, maybe we could just dive into the complexity of that a little bit as well as it pertains to Christology, because I think some people would assume that because Jesus shares the throne or may share the throne here, that therefore makes him I don't know how to say, like co-equal with the God of Israel, which is a
Yep.
way you can read it. But we have to, I think, also be honest historically that that's a motif we have in other places. Famously in a Jewish text in the similitudes or parables of Enoch, where you have a figure sharing the throne with God, and then it's a motif, as you bring out, that you have more broadly in just ancient Mediterranean royal ideologies. So yeah, I know that's a lot, but maybe first off, if you could just kind of take us through what is it and how do we see that, and then does that add a layer of complexity to how we think about the Christology of Revelation?
Yeah. Well, first I have to give credit to Clint Burnett,
Mm-hmm.
who's taught me a lot. Not everything I know about throne sharing, but man, he's doing some really great work in this concept and how important it is within kind of divine honors discourses, and not just in Revelation, but more broadly in the New Testament. So Clint Burnett's work on throne sharing is really important resources for people interested in this topic. Throne sharing just occurs when someone shares a divine throne. So this could be gods sharing the same throne. It could be, in the hierarchy of gods, a lesser god sharing an Olympian throne of an Olympian god. Very often, it's at least in the Greek world, this is pretty much absent in Israelite tradition for reasons that will become clear in a minute, but where kings and other prominent individuals, either during their lifetimes or after their death, are imagined to share a divine throne.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a divine honor, which is to say an honor, the highest honor, an honor that is reserved for those of the highest standing, which is what a god is. So I think the fact that it's such a high honor that goes so far as to kind of associate with a mortal with the divine figure is the reason that motif is absent in so much Jewish literature. Now, in Jewish texts written in Greek, you find this. So the Similitudes is a great example. There are other instances. At Qumran, you have a very explicit example of a human. And
You're referring to the self-glorification hymn? Yeah.
Exactly. And it's not condemned. It's promoted. It's accepted. It's glorified. Whereas in Hebrew texts you have foreign rulers arrogating for themselves a place on God's throne, and that being censured, condemned. So there's ambivalence about it. It seems in Israelite and Jewish traditions. In the Greek world, there seems to be no reluctance to imagine that prominent figures, especially kings, would be granted this kind of divine honor either during their lifetimes or after they've died.
Mm-hmm.
So the fact that Jesus shows up in Revelation either on God's throne or even in close proximity to God's throne, that would constitute divine throne sharing by just about any definition of it. So
Mm-hmm.
it's interesting that in this Christian text, you would have no reluctance to put Jesus in this position. The crucified and risen Jesus in the position of sharing God's own throne. I mean, that's a big claim.
Yeah.
And I think I hope I'm pronouncing is it Ruben Benner?
Yeah, Booner. Yeah, yeah. I just had him on the podcast. Yeah, he wrote pretty extensively on kind of the high messianic Christology and so forth.
Yeah, and it's a high messianic claim. It's a high Christological claim to make for Jesus, to put him even in the proximity of God's throne in the throne room. And it happens a couple of different times, and that's why there's some ambivalence about it, because the language used to describe Jesus' actual place vis-a-vis God's throne is debated. But it's a divine honor given to Jesus, and this likens him not just to other figures in Greek-speaking Jewish traditions, but in the wider Greek world where this is more or less common.
Mm-hmm. So it's a motif that would make sense to people in that cultural context, although, as you're saying, in a Jewish context, it may not be a comfortable idea to everyone. Some maybe have more level of comfort with it than others. For
exactly.
Yeah,
I think that's a really good way of putting it. I mean, I would imagine some of the resistance that people would have had to the Christological claims being made about Jesus were these kinds of claims. Jesus shares a throne with God in heaven. You just don't make those kinds of claims commonly, or at least not in certain Jewish contexts. And so Jesus' place on the divine throne is part and parcel of the claim made by the author of Revelation that Jesus is a worthy recipient of this and other divine honors. So divine throne sharing is just one piece of a litany of divine honors that the Lamb receives. So hymnic praise is divine praise. So Jesus receives on the throne praise that God would otherwise receive and does receive at the same time with the same kind of language. So that's a worldview that I would imagine a lot of Jewish people in the first century would have had a hard time coming to terms with.
Yeah, no, that's great.
Because the claims are so strong.
Yeah. Well, and just to give our audience one example of how that could play out, if you think about Acts chapter 7, the famous stoning of Stephen, Stephen's giving a prophetic kind of critique and speech, which could have gone a number of different ways. He obviously made some people very angry, the temple leadership, but no one thinks to stone him or that he needs to die until he gazes up into the heavens and sees the Son of Man standing at the right hand of the throne. And I think the clear implication in that scene, at least, is for that audience, that's not appropriate. That's the problem.
Well, right. And you do have in the Hebrew Bible and in other Jewish traditions, divine figures sharing the throne with God. So in Daniel 7, the Son of Man is there, and there's a close relationship between the Son of Man and God in Daniel, and elsewhere. So the fact, right, in Acts and in Revelation, for Christians to be making, or Jesus followers to be making the claim that Jesus is the Son of Man who shares the divine throne, who is worthy of divine praise. I mean, it's a shocking claim.
Yeah, for sure. Could we get into a little bit? So the idea of the slaughtered lamb being victorious, I'd love to hear your thinking about the ideology of victory of the ruler and how that plays out. But if you wouldn't mind, I mean, you touch on it in the book, but if you wouldn't mind, spelling out for us a little bit more, maybe how the ideology of victory works itself out in Revelation. Because I think a big question people have is, okay, the slaughtered lamb conquers, but we do have a lot of violent militaristic language in the text as well. How does that fit into his conquering through the cross? Is it he's conquered and the first time by the cross and the next time by the sword, and what do you see this violence? Like, I guess I'm wondering, is this violence in Revelation, is it descriptions of what the community is hoping Jesus will come back and do, or do we think of it maybe along the lines of almost like, I don't want to sound trite, but like kind of almost like a coping mechanism of an oppressed group, like a Psalm 137, where you have violent imagery, but it's not people that are going to exact that. They are desperately crying out for justice against a group that is oppressing them. Anyway, I'd love to just kind of hear your thinking. So first off, obviously this goes beyond what you do in the book. I'm kind of cheating here a little bit, but I'd love to hear first, like what you make of the victory. What are you doing with victory motif in the book? And then how do you see that playing out more broadly in the rhetoric of the rest of Revelation?
Yeah. So the idea that Jesus' crucifixion constitutes some kind of victory is itself a paradoxical claim, right? I mean, obviously, or maybe it's not obvious in a Christian context, 21st century Christian context, but in a first century Roman context, being crucified, you're not winning if you're being crucified.
Right.
You are, and I really have to work to make this point to students in my class who are used to seeing Jesus, on a cross in church context and on necklaces. It's such a common motif. Jesus crucified. It's a good thing. It's a good thing for Christians. And so then it's hard to go back and situate that event in the way that most first century folks, including Jesus followers, would have understand it, which is, well, this is the end. And it's not just, Jesus' death. It's a really shameful, painful, excruciating way to die.
Right.
And, I explained to students that his mom, I try and put them into the visual, putting it in sight. Like, you're his mom watching him slowly suffocate to death. And you have to have that in mind when considering the early Christian claim that this death constituted a victory. It was a really good thing. You have to understand that it was really not a good thing by the standards of the world at the time. So the author of Revelation makes this claim that Jesus' death is the mechanism or the grounds for God's honoring him with his place in heaven and his kind of divine status and hymnic praise and place on the throne. So it's the key to his election in the first place is his death. And the author of Revelation has antecedent language in third and fourth Maccabees. Those who suffer persecution are described as conquerors. So they use the Greek verb nikao, to win or to conquer. And so the author of Revelation kind of borrows that language, that Jesus' suffering can be imagined as a kind of victory or conquest. So it's not totally, a novel claim. He's borrowing Jewish notions of suffering as victory. But then the author of Revelation is layering onto that the much more common ways of thinking about victory, which is those who are winning in the Colosseum, or they're winning the chariot races, or they're winning musical competitions, they're winning dramatic competitions. It's going all the way back to Aeschylus and Sophocles and Euripides gaining the crown and winning. So victory in the much more common sense. And oftentimes you'd get a victory crown when you'd win. So the author of Revelation is taking those two conceptual worlds of victory and combining them so that Jesus' death is a victory in the sense that it was in third and fourth Maccabees. It's also his crowning and becoming God's chosen king in the other sense. Does that make sense?
Totally. Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, very much so. And you see this, you bring it out in the chapter, but just for our audience who, just to track with us, you see this kind of language show up in the letters to the seven churches where the rhetoric is of overcoming and being victorious. And the audience is promised various rewards for doing that, sharing in the Messianic rule, Psalm 2:9, things like this. You victory, you overcome, and very common kind of idea, right? And
right, it's important that when you bring up the letters, because the question of who's actually receiving the message of the visions, and different scholars have different ideas, but clearly, the seven churches mentioned in the letters may have been among the first people to receive this prophecy, really, or vision. And the fact that they are identified, or they're identified as people who will themselves be conquerors. So to the one who conquers, I will give, and then there's some benefit.
Yeah.
So not, in the same way that Jesus has suffered and has been glorified, the author of Revelation imagines that Jesus' followers in the churches will too suffer and be glorified under certain circumstances, at least.
Yeah. You don't just get to be a jerk and say I'm overcoming persecution, but yeah, real persecution. Yes.
Real, yeah.
Okay, so for the audience, suffering, the form of overcoming, of the conquering, takes place through endurance, basically various forms of endurance. How does that fit then? Like, how would you tie that in with the violent imagery that we find in Revelation?
Yeah. So here's another place where different commentators say wildly different things, really opposite. I mean, to me, I don't see any way around the violent imagery at the end of the text. I mean, the lamb is in total battle mode. There's just no way around that. And I know that some really smart people try and make the claim that, in fact, the violence is kind of assuaged somehow, or really the lamb imagery somehow kind of counteracts the lion imagery. I don't see that. I see the function of the lamb as king, and as kings did, to do conquering of the militant sort.
Mm-hmm.
And I wrestle with that. I have a problem with it. Honestly, I don't, it just doesn't come kind of naturally to me to think about Jesus acting that way or imagining Jesus performing that role. But that's one of the primary roles of kings, is to lead armies of soldiers into other lands and to conquer, in that sense of the word. So I think that's described pretty clearly. But I also think that image has to be understood in the context that you brought up, which is of a suffering minority, a group of people who are, just in terms of numbers, a minority, but are probably being persecuted in real ways in the time that Revelation was written. So maybe not in the way that people thought a couple of generations ago about mass persecutions of Christians by Nero or Domitian, but in the way that Adela Yarborough Collins describes, localized persecution, even if it's Jewish folks who become Christ followers who are then ridiculed or persecuted in kind of lesser ways by their Jewish brothers who are not Christ followers. So the audience of Revelation, the author of Revelation, who presents himself as being in prison, in a Roman prison, clearly he sees himself as a victim of persecution. He presents his audience as victims of persecution. There are Christians who are dying. This is underlying all of Revelation. So the image of a reversal where the ones persecuted become the ones in power, the ones who lack power and prestige and status become the ones with divine power and prestige and status, functions a lot like movies like Django Unchained or Inglourious Bastards. I don't know if you're familiar with these movies, Tarantino movies, where the audience is allowed to experience, as in Inglourious Bastards, what it's like for Hitler to meet his match, to actually, for those who have been persecuted by Hitler, to then destroy Hitler, or for the former slave, as in Django Unchained, to take his revenge on his slave owner in very graphic, violent ways that ends in the death of the slave owner. I don't know if you or your audience is familiar with these movies, but to me,
this is helpful.
This is how Revelation's violence works. There's no taking away the violence, but it performs a function for people who are suffering. It provides them an imaginative space for something other than their suffering. And so the fact that they imagine their persecutors suffering under a vengeful God who wants to bring them to justice, you can't take away that violent imagery, but it functions differently for people who have been persecuted than it does for people in a first world nation who already have military power and economic strength.
Yeah.
So I think back to the way that you framed this question originally, you didn't say this exactly, but maybe how do Christians or people today take this imagery? Like, what do they do with it? For Jesus followers today, what do you do with this image of this violent Messiah? And I think you have to be extremely careful with it and recognize in its context, it did something different. It functioned in a very particular way that doesn't make a lot of sense, at least not to all people in the same way today.
I think that's really helpful. No, that's great. That's really helpful. And what I'm hearing you saying then is that the function there, it is very similar to imprecatory psalms then in terms of what it's doing.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I was don't want to say surprised by, but maybe a little bit. And this probably reflects my own life experience as a middle-class white male, is that when I had students write for me reflections and papers on imprecatory Psalms, I found very clearly that students from historically marginalized communities resonated a lot more with what these Psalms were doing than students from more privileged cultural groups. And I suspect if we looked at the global church today and we read Revelation among communities that were enduring extreme persecution, they might get Revelation in a way that we just don't in North America, maybe, or many of us in North America don't get.
It's important for me to note, even though I'm not going to be able to remember their names, Revelation scholars, there's a South African scholar who wrote in the 70s, 80s, who not only doesn't want to kind of minimize the violent, the vengeful God who destroys oppressors, but who, working in a context of apartheid in South Africa in the 70s and 80s, wants to lift that up as a model for divine vengeance. Like God, as a just God, destroys oppressors. And so Revelation provides for him a model for that. And I don't know if it's Miroslav Volf or another theologian, but someone who takes in the context of the wars in Bosnia Herzegovina in the 90s as takes Revelation as a model of how God can be thought to function in a time of war, for those who are dying. And so, but it has to be used very carefully. It's used by people in power as a source for their oppression, then that's not, I think, the way that the author of Revelation would have imagined its use. I don't think the author of Revelation could have imagined, even though he presents it as such, Jesus on the throne and Christians, around the throne worshiping and in full glory. I don't know he imagined it, but did he, in reality, did he imagine that would be the case?
Yeah. No, it's good. I mean, I think what it is, it's a very radical, but it is ultimately a strategy of nonviolence, because you're leaving vengeance in the hands of God, right? So you're imagining this stuff, and it is. I don't know. I mean, maybe this is overdoing it on my part, but I kind of think about it as almost a means of lament, of working with an unjust situation, reflecting to God how we feel like we would like vengeance to be taken. This is unjust. You are the God who can take vengeance. And then the end of it is, though, acknowledgement that it is God's to judge, and God's people are not the ones who are going to take up arms and try to take vengeance into their own hands. So,
yeah, exactly. Well, and Adelia Yarborough Collins is the one who 40 years ago now made this strong persuasive claim that Revelation as a whole functions cathartically for early Christians who are being persecuted, if not by emperor, by in their local communities for various reasons. And so that the imagination of their persecutors being overthrown has this tangible cathartic effect.
Yeah, the book is Crisis and Catharsis. Is that the title?
That's right.
It's a classic book, so our audience definitely check it out. All right, that's really helpful. Thanks for indulging me there, Justin. I just think that's an issue that is on everybody's mind when they deal with Revelation. Yeah. So to have a Revelation scholar with us, I couldn't help but ask it. Can you take us into a little bit of the concept of what benefaction is in the ancient world, and how Jesus is presented as kind of like the broker of God's gifts to the community, and how God's benefactor. How does that work out in Revelation?
Yeah, I think I learned a lot of things writing this book, but I think I learned much more about patronage and benefaction and its importance socially, economically, politically in the ancient world. I learned more about that, much more than I thought I would. And I've come away from this book with thoughts about future projects. It would be how patronage and benefaction function in the ancient world, how it was appropriated by early Christians, um, and non-Christ following Jewish people to explain their relationships with God and their relationships with each other, how Christ followers used patronage and benefaction to understand the relationship to God through Jesus as a kind of mediator or broker. And so, patronage is basically a relationship that exists between two entities. It could be two individuals. It could be an individual and an institution. It could be, and most often was, established between people of different status, whether it's economic status or social status or political status. And it was established so that a person on the lower rung would receive some benefit from a superior, and that could be, just about anything. It could be a job, it could be a spouse, it could be legal fees, and it could be, depending on who. So the patron was the one providing the benefit, and the client was the one receiving the benefit. If your patron was of means, the higher the means of the patron, the greater the benefit provided. So if your patron was God, and this is how a lot of Greeks and Jewish folks thought about God. God is the ultimate patron.
Mm-hmm.
What more could you want than, rivers and mountains and the sun shining? And, this is what God has provided to people as a divine patron. And so the patron provides, the client receives, but it is a relationship. It's not one-sided or one way. So while the patron provides benefits to the client must respond, not in kind either. So usually, because of the hierarchical relationship, the client was not in a position to be able to provide the same kind of benefits. So
Mm-hmm.
very often the client would provide to the patron the prestige of simply being in a position of having a client. So if a patron had several clients who would show up at the morning salutatio, wow, what a demonstration of that patron's prestige to have so many people who are receiving benefits from him or her.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Lots of examples of female patrons in the ancient world. Um, More tangibly, the client would respond to the patron with extreme loyalty. So that was an expectation, is
Mm-hmm.
that was whatever the means of the client was, the client could provide loyalty in exchange
Mm-hmm.
for whatever benefits the patron was providing.
And
So
just to jump in there real quick to make one point of connection for our audience, because this probably wouldn't be obvious. The Greek term for faith means loyalty, pistis, and the Latin equivalent fides, loyalty, faith as well. So what Justin's talking about here ties directly into how the New Testament talks about faith. Just to make
yeah,
that connection. Okay, so keep going.
super important point. In fact, I was talking with one of my favorite New Testament scholars, Josh Jipp, this morning about pistis as loyalty, and how Paul uses this term, and how there's so much ambivalence about the faith of Jesus Christ, and how understanding that within a patronage relationship. And Douglas Campbell has done work on this, and others have tried to situate that pistis
Mm-hmm.
faith language within a patronage benefaction context. So back to Revelation and early Christians, they appropriate this ideology and discourse of patronage and apply it freely to God and to Jesus, so that God is thought to be the ultimate patron, and Jesus is kind of a broker, which is to say kind of a mid-level patron. So as recipients of God's gifts, either on their own or through Christ, the followers of God and Christ have obligation to God and to Christ, or in Revelation's language, to God and the Lamb,
Mm-hmm.
to demonstrate loyalty as a reciprocal, as a response to the benefits they've received. So in what we call closed benefaction systems, you can only have one patron. You cannot have competing patrons. Now, in the non-Jewish world, it was very common for a client to have multiple patrons, and including divine patrons. So you could, in the morning,
the more the better. The more gods you have on your team, the better. Yeah, absolutely.
Exactly. You don't.
And the Romans modeled this, by the way. They have, invocatio. They invoke the gods of other nations, and when they defeat them, they take that god on, build a temple for him. It's great.
Yeah, you don't want to leave any gods out, and you might as well, let's not miss any gods. Jewish folks are quite different on that particular point. Jewish folks go out of their way to demonstrate what we call a closed benefaction system, where God is the only patron worthy of divine honors. Mm-hmm. So, and I think that language of honors in response to the patron's benefits is really important as it relates to Revelation, because that's precisely what the author of Revelation calls Jesus followers to do, is to respond to God's gifts through Christ with honor and praise and hymns and a recognition that Jesus is in fact worthy of these high messianic claims.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's a claim, it's a claim that needs to be made in the first century in the context of competing claims to loyalty, right? The emperors require loyalty from the subjects, and the fact that Jews and Christians won't demonstrate loyalty to both God and to the emperor, or to Jesus and the emperor, is well documented in Jewish and Christian sources. Super conspicuous in Revelation. You can't worship the beast. Wow, if you're loyal to God, it's impossible. And so the dichotomy between worship of God and Jesus in chapters 4 and 5 on the one hand, and the worship of the beast in chapter 13 on the other, like it couldn't be a clearer antithesis of a demonstration of competing loyalties. So, in order to understand why Christians could not offer eat meat sacrificed to idols, or go to the temple and worship the gods of the Roman pantheon, you have to understand how divine patronage works in Jewish systems.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great.
Closed, in particular, the closed benefaction or patronage system.
Yeah, no, 100%, right, and that, that seems to be the major sticking point for the early Jesus movement is precisely this issue, and for people just to appreciate who we are not talking about a world where people are policing your ideas, like your religious ideas are what offend people or whatever. We're talking about a world where your participation in certain rites and traditions of your ancestors, of your people, of the empire, that's what knits this whole world together. So to be part of a closed benefaction system, it's one thing if you're Jewish and you have some sort of recognition within the Roman Empire of being legitimately exempted from that to an extent, although of course this can lead to various forms of hostility and persecution. When you have a movement where we're encouraging more and more Gentiles to turn away from their emperor worship and their ancestral gods, that becomes very problematic. And that's really what leads to a lot of, I think, this tension. So
absolutely.
Yeah. Very good. Well, man, there's so many more questions I want to ask you. Maybe if I could, I know we're getting close to the end of our time. This is more of another one of those beyond the book kind of pastoral, interpretive pastoral questions. I'm struck by the dissonance between the way scholars of Revelation, historically, critically trained scholars, handle Revelation versus the way Revelation is handled in more popular Christian culture. And it seems like that's one of the things I really appreciated about Baucham's theology of Revelation, and why I assign it so often to students, along with I think it's Michael Gorman's book, Reading Revelation Responsibly.
Yep.
There is this space for the need to translate this very particular book. hey, we treat Paul's letters as if they're, occasional documents, well, Revelation is a series of letters to actual flesh and blood
Yeah.
late first century communities. So we have to handle it with, I think, the same kind of care. So do you have any advice for people today, Christians today, who may be listening to this or watching this? They're thinking, gosh, all I've heard about Revelation is this I love, actually, I think Luke Johnson has the best line about this in his intro to the New Testament writings, where he talks about, people treat Revelation like it's a train schedule, just kind of outlining everything, and that's the way to read it, versus what seems really clear if you read it contextually, that all of this stuff fits within a particular first century context. And that has to be honored initially if we're going to make sense hermeneutically of how this book is speaking as scripture to us today. I don't want to ramble anymore, but just any thoughts you have along those lines for people.
Yeah, I think maybe more than any other New Testament text, and I'm only saying that carefully. If I were in another context, I'd say absolutely Revelation is the most is the text that is, for which there's the greatest difference between lay folks and scholars. I think I continually run into people when they find out I'm a Revelation scholar who seem to think that there is a key, that can unlock the future, the eschaton and things. And that is just simply not how very many scholars of Revelation, including very faithful and including very conservative Christian scholars, think about its function. I want to mention Greg Carey. He has a great study guide. It's maybe not brand new anymore. It's about a year old, called Faithful and True, Study Guide of Revelation. I think he really helpfully lays out for lay readers how scholars view Revelation functioning in its first century context, not as a train schedule or as a roadmap for the future or as predicting the rise and fall of Donald Trump or any other 21st century character, but how Revelation really has a lot of meaning for Christians in the 21st century, even if it's not predictive for the 21st century. So just because Revelation was written for an audience of people in Asia Minor in the first century who were going through all sorts of hardships and kind of coming to an awareness of their belief systems and how that their belief in Jesus interacted with previous, with Hebrew scriptures, and how Gentiles might be brought into this community of Jewish Jesus followers. Like they're working through a lot of difficult things, and Revelation speaks to that situation in very concrete ways. Oftentimes people say to me, "Oh, you study Revelation, it's the hardest text to understand. It's the most, kind of obscure, esoteric text." Not to me. Paul is esoteric and obscure. Paul, to me, is much harder to understand. And I think that's borne out in scholarship. Like there are fundamental disagreements about, what Paul is doing and how he should be situated. Not so with Revelation. There is a real consistency that's very gratifying. The key to unlocking Revelation is not so difficult. The first century imperial context and the struggle that Christians had to reconcile their views with an imperial world is a very concrete, accessible key to unlocking the book of Revelation. And I think there's a lot of meaning for Christians today who are living also in an imperial world. I mean, we have empires today, and we have idols that we are worshiping today. And I think the book of Revelation speaks to an audience of Christians today just as well as it did in the first century.
Yeah, I love it. And it's something that, thanks for the recommendation from Carrie, by the way. That's not one that was on my radar, and it should be. So for our audience, that's a great one. One of the things that I think Bauckham really brought up too in his little study is that it is, I think, helpful for us today to recognize that the author never names the empire as Rome. It's Babylon, which is the the classic empire that oppresses God's people. And
Yep.
what that does then, it basically creates a role description that any empire or institution could play at any
Right.
given moment. And so at various
Yep.
points in history, we might identify beast-like features with certain empires, imperial powers, or whatever. So, yeah.
Right. But in order to understand how that symbolic language not only was functioning in the text, but how it might function today, it needs to be grounded.
Yeah.
In
Yeah.
order to understand that Revelation is using Babylon to talk about Rome, and that, it's a model for talking about oppressive structures that are antithetical to the rule of God. And that language can be applied today in the same way. Now, it's not Rome, but we can talk about, and we talk about, the United States is or New York is the new Rome, or whatever John Lennon said. We use the same language to talk about oppressive structures today using biblical language. So
For sure.
yeah.
Well, yeah, thanks. Hey, Justin, thank you so much for your time. Again, everybody, fantastic book right here, Royal Ideologies in the Book of Revelation. Highly recommend it. As I said, again, it's a great place if you are interested in this topic of Messianism, royal ideologies in the ancient world, not just in the Book of Revelation, but more broadly, you're trying to get into it. This book will take you into the primary sources. It'll give you a million different angles into this question. So highly recommend it. And Justin, thanks for your time.
Thanks so much, Max. I appreciate the invitation.
Yeah.
Take care.
All right. Thanks. Thanks for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please make sure that you are subscribed to our channel for more content. And if you're interested in supporting us, the best way you can do so is by becoming a member of the Center for Bible Study. Link in the description. Thanks.